You're tuning into the High Performance Path podcast, and I'm your host, Alex. If you want to increase your productivity, enhance your mental performance, hack your sleep, and build a bulletproof body, then you're in the right place. Get ready as we dive into interviews with performance coaches, business owners, and health professionals to find out their daily routines, habits, and movement practices. All right, let's go.
Welcome to the show, and thanks for taking the time to jump on the Zoom meeting with me. Where are you joining us from? Can you tell the listeners?
Thank you for inviting me. I'm joining you from Columbus, Ohio, so here in the great state of Ohio. So for those who follow our college football, Go Bucks, that's our big football team here. So that's Ohio is well known for that. Yeah, it's heartland of America.
Awesome. Can you explain to the listeners who you are, what you do, and then we'll dive into a little bit more about what you do shortly.
My expertise is in helping folks avoid disasters. Now, disasters, as I'm sure you might guess, come from two things. They come from our decisions, and specifically two types of decisions. One is a type of our active decision. So make a decision that leads to disaster, or a series of decisions that lead to disaster. That's pretty frequent. That's kind of on the one hand. On the other hand, we might fail to make a decision that averts a disaster. So the omission, the problem of omitting the right decision, leading to a disaster. And there's plenty of those. So those are the big two categories of disasters that you want to be thinking about. And they all have to do with our decision making, how we make decisions. We make decisions very badly, unfortunately, because we just follow our intuitions. We can talk about that on the show. My expertise is in the cognitive neuroscience and behavioral economics of decision making. Cognitive neuroscience has to do with the structure of our brain. So I'm a cognitive neuroscientist. And behavioral economics has to do with how we behave in economic situations. And I'm a behavioral economist. I study structure, how our mind causes us to behave in economic situations. And I've spent about 15 years in academia studying this, including 7 years as a professor at Ohio State, previously a fellow at UNC Chapel Hill. But all of this during this time, even before that, I spent 20 years as a consultant, coach, and trainer on decision making, practically helping folks make better decisions, leaders, executives, whoever, coaching them on decision making, risk management, strategic planning, disaster avoidance, and consulting for companies ranging from Fortune 500s to startup to major startups. You know, I have my clients involved with everyone from Aflac to Xerox. So if you know Zoom, give me a call. Now, my background also includes writing a number of books. So I've written 4 prominent books. Never Go With Your Gut, How Pioneering Leaders Make the Best Decisions and Avoid Business Disasters is what I'm best known for. It's published by Career Press in 2019. It's a great traditionally published book, focuses on business leadership, career leadership, financial decision-making, all of that type of stuff, everything in our professional world. Another book that I published, well-known, is The Truth Seeker's Handbook, a science-based guide, focusing on how do we figure out the truth of reality despite our dangerous judgment errors and blind spots, and how do we address them. Another book that I published is called The Blind Spots Between Us, How to Overcome Unconscious Bias and Build Better Relationships. And that, as you can guess, focuses on relationships, professional and personal. And finally, a book that just very recently was published. So the Truth Seeker's Handbook was by Intentional Insights. The Blind Spots Between Us is by New Harbinger. This new book is published with Changemakers Books, and it's called Resilience, Adapt and Plan for the New Abnormal of the COVID-19 Coronavirus Pandemic. And of course, it's kind of like it sounds. How do you adapt and plan in the context of the coronavirus pandemic and the bad decisions we tend to make in this setting? So that's my background. I've published about 550 articles and appeared in 450 interviews in venues like Time, Inc. Magazine, Fast Company, CBS News, CNBC, Entrepreneur. I can go on and on and on. So that's kind of my background. That's what I do, and that's my expertise.
That's awesome. That last book that you mentioned, is that out now? The one about
yes, it just came out on May 15th.
Yeah, interesting. I didn't actually know that was out.
Not many do. It's just published.
Cool. I want to maybe dive into
that. You can see that in the corner over there, the Resilience Adapt and Plan. Very far one.
Yeah. Cool. That might be pretty interesting to dive into. But before we dive into that, the first book that you mentioned, I've actually just finished reading that, and I want to talk about a few things that were in that book. So that was Never Go With Your Gut, that book. So in that book, you talk about, as you know, we evolved as humans to cope with situations in the savannah.
Mm-hmm.
And in the last 2,000 years or so, our society's changed so quickly that our bodies haven't been able to evolve quick enough to adapt.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk about some of the things in our day-to-day that can trigger in us reactions that our bodies and that our brains can't tell the difference between, life and death situations, etc.? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Happy to. So the crucial thing to understand is that we tend to go with our gut when we make decisions, right? That's what people tell you, to go with your gut, follow your intuitions, trust your heart, and so on. That is the typical advice that we get. That's unfortunately what the cutting edge research in cognitive neuroscience, behavioral economics, psychology shows is that's a really bad idea, because our gut reactions, while they feel comfortable, while they feel like it's the right thing to do, it's the right thing to do, the right thing to believe, the right thing to credit, unfortunately, they are not evolved for the modern environment. They're our instincts. They're evolved for the savannah environment. When we lived in small tribes of 15 people to 150 people, we were hunter-gatherers and foragers. That's what they're evolved for. So we make a whole lot of mistakes when we go with our gut in the modern world. I mean, consider the fight or flight response. That's our major response to threats. So the fight or flight response is how we respond to threats. That's our intuition. That's our gut instinct. Now, in the savannah environment, that was great. We had to jump at 100 shadows to get away from that one saber-toothed tiger. That's great. It was called the saber-toothed tiger response. You might have heard of it as that as well. Unfortunately, in the modern world, we have many less saber-toothed tigers. So that's great for us, but we still have the saber-toothed tiger response in responding to threats. Think about this. Imagine that you get some constructive critical feedback from a client who sends you an email about some constructive critical feedback. Now, what's the natural inclination? What's the intuitive response? Well, some people who are more risk averse, they would tend to have a flight response, meaning ignoring the information, ignoring the email, deleting it, pretending it never happened. That's one type of response. Not a great response. The other type of response, the fight response, that's people who are more aggressive, who are problem-solving oriented. What they would do is push back. They would tend to write an email back to the client and say, what are you talking about? You're wrong, I'm right, you're a jerk, I'm great. That's the fight response. Neither of those is the right response if you actually want to address the situation. If you want to address the situation, what I'm sure you need to do is look at what in your underlying systems and processes, the way you do things, the way you organize things, the way your company does things, the way your business runs things, the way your division runs things, what caused the negative response by your client, whether it's an external client, an internal client, whoever. What caused that negative response? Look at the systems, the processes, and see the underlying root causes of the problematic response by the client. Because, if one client wrote back and said this, probably 100 people are thinking it and not saying it, just leaving you without you realizing why they left you as a client. So you want to look at that underlying cause and figure out how are you going to solve that underlying cause, that underlying problem. And then you want to write back an email, of course, to the client saying, hey, I figured out what's going on. Here's the issue. Here's I'm planning to solve it. I really apologize for the situation coming about. Soothing ruffled feathers and giving specific descriptions of how you'll solve that problem. That's a very unintuitive response. Let's just be honest. Very unintuitive. It's a hard thing to do. It involves a subset of skills, which has to do with emotional management. You have to manage your emotions. Then in understanding your systems and processes, understanding the need to look at them, evaluate them, look at the problems, root causes, and so on, and then show emotional and social intelligence and smoothing ruffled feathers. That's a whole subset of skills that is learned. That's not a primitive, natural, savage response. It's like Tony Robbins said, be primal. That's his big, thing. That's a terrible, terrible advice, and many other types of advice like this, because what you want to do is do the civilized thing, which is exactly what I'm talking about. That you look at the systems, the processes, and address the underlying root causes and problems. Again, very intuitive, but very important to do. So that is the kind of thing, that's just one example out of literally thousands, where we make really bad decisions because we tend to follow our gut reactions, as opposed to in having the civilized response. And of course, civilized means adaptive to the modern world. So there are a number of things in the book that I talk about which are the mental habits you need to build up to have civilized responses to professional threats, to professional issues. And my other books talk about other life areas, whether relationships, whether COVID-19, and so on.
Yeah, awesome. So I've got written down in my notes from reading that book, 12 techniques for everyday business scenarios.
Mm-hmm.
Do you want to dive into those a little?
Yes, happy to.
Let's do
The
it.
first thing to understand is that we have specific failure modes called cognitive biases. You might have heard of this phrase, cognitive biases. These are the dangerous judgment errors we tend to fall into as human beings. And there are hundreds of them. You can take a look at the list of cognitive biases on Wikipedia. My book, Never Go With Your Gut, How Pioneering Leaders Make the Best Decisions and Avoid Business Disasters, talks about the most important 30 cognitive biases in professional settings and how do you address them. That's my expertise. So there are some folks whose expertise is in figuring out how we're screwed up. My expertise is in figuring out how to fix these problems. So that's the practice of debiasing. And there are 12 specific techniques that I talk about in the book that are involved in this debiasing. How do you fix these problems? The first technique is identifying and making a plan to address these dangerous judgment errors. You need to understand what are your dangerous judgment errors, which cognitive biases, which of these dangerous judgment errors, these mental blind spots, which are most prevalent for you. For example, for me, one of the biggest problems for me is called the optimism bias. That's kind of like it sounds. I have a very positive view of the world. I feel that the world is a friendly place, even though it may not be sometimes. I feel like the grass is green on the other side of the hill, even though it may not be green, and even though it may be yellow. I have a very high expectations for myself and for other people, and it's hard to live up to them. I tend to focus on opportunities, not threats, and so I tend to be risk blind. That is a problem because I have 20 ideas before breakfast and I think they're all brilliant when they're really not. So I know that I need to address this cognitive bias. Once I started learning about these cognitive biases when I was going to UNC Chapel Hill getting my PhD, I learned about the optimism bias, and it suddenly became clear to me how many bad decisions I've been making. I mean, obviously I was making bad decisions, before I knew about this, and still don't make the perfect decisions. But it became obvious to me the kind of bad decisions I was making because of the optimism bias and how I need to address it. So the first step, of course, is identifying these. And my book, Never Go With Your Gut, How Pioneering Leaders Make the Best Decisions and Avoid Business Disasters, has an assessment in the end as chapter 7, which helps you assess which of these cognitive biases are most prevalent for you and in your workplace. So the first step, like I said, the first technique, identifying and then making a plan to address these dangerous judgment errors. So I'll talk through a couple of ways I address the optimism bias. One of them involves the technique that I talk about, another debiasing technique called getting an external perspective. So getting an external perspective, that's another one of the 12 techniques for addressing cognitive biases. Getting an external perspective means making sure to go to someone who has the opposite challenge called the pessimism bias and getting their perspective on my 20 brilliant ideas before breakfast. So pessimism bias, of course, is the opposite of the optimism bias. It's people who see the world as a mostly hostile place. People who think the grass is always yellow on the other side of the hill, even though it's sometimes green. These are people who are oriented toward threats, not opportunities. And they tend to be too risk averse for their own good. So, the pessimism bias. Now, I run a 6-people company called Disaster Avoidance Experts, consulting, coaching, and training firm. And it's very tempting for me to hire other optimists in the team because I click very well with them. It's very intuitive for me. I like them. We're very comfortable together. But I know I have learned I need to hire people with whom I don't like to work. I don't feel pleasant. I don't feel like it's a good thing for me intuitively. My gut intuition doesn't really act well to them, the pessimists. Now, the problem is if we had all optimists, if everyone had 20 ideas before breakfast and thought they were all brilliant, we'd reinforce each other's ideas and then we'd be running in 120 different directions. That's not great. There's a reason that many companies fail, small businesses fail, and my company, of course, is a small business. So about half of all small businesses fail within the first 5 years, about 10 within the first, about 2/3 within the first 10 years and 3/4 in the first 15 years. And that's before the pandemic. So this is a big problem. And that's one of the biggest reasons, is that they're not focused enough. One of the two biggest causes of small business failure is running out of resources, cash mainly, before they become profitable because they're focusing on too many things at once. Bad idea. So what I learned I need to do is hire pessimists on the team and give them my 20 brilliant ideas. And they'll say, hey, here, these are, all have baked potatoes, but here are the three least worst of them. And I look at these ideas, the ones that they say are freely useful, and I see them as, the best of the ideas, and they see them as the least worst. So that gives you a little bit of an insight on the perspective difference between us, right? It's unpleasant, but it's so important. So then they're great. They're terrible at generating ideas, pessimists are, because they see the intuitive flaws of each idea. But they're great at figuring out how to solve the problems in each idea, how to fix the flaws, and then how to implement them effectively. So that's their strength. So I give them these ideas, and then they give feedback and implement them. And that's getting an external perspective. So that's a really important technique. That's the second technique that I want to share about. Now, another technique that is really important with addressing the optimism bias is called delaying decision making. And that's kind of like it sounds. You want to delay decision making. Your mom might have taught you to count to 10 before responding emotionally. Well, the optimism bias always causes me to respond emotionally in decisions. The pessimism bias causes people to respond emotionally in decisions as well if they're pessimistic. So that is something I need to delay. So I make sure to count to 10 before I make even a casual decision and evaluate, hey, am I being too optimistic here? Am I being too positive? What can go wrong? What are the problems? And there's a specific technique that you want to apply for not screwing up decisions that we can talk about later, 5 questions. But anyway, for this one, for the optimism bias, delaying decision making is really important. Then another technique that you want to think about that I use in addressing the optimism bias is considering the alternative. That's a fourth technique I want to share about. So considering the alternative. You want to always consider what might be the alternative, especially the opposite. Considering alternatives, especially the opposite of your scenario. So if you think that you are going to send an email to your client saying that, hey, what are you talking about? I'm right, you're wrong. And the client will just say, yes, you're absolutely right. Yeah, totally. I understand now I'm wrong. That it usually doesn't work that way. That's not how the world spins. So you need to understand, to consider the alternative and consider how other humans behave. So that's kind of another technique that I use, and that's really important. Fifth one that I want to share about is called probabilistic thinking. Probabilistic thinking is a great, super important technique. It helps you evaluate what the world looks like based on probabilities of reality. Now, that seems a little complicated, but it's really not. Because the problem with our intuitive perspective, with our gut reactions, is it's very binary. It's either yes or no, black and white. It doesn't accept the idea of ambiguity, of uncertainty, of confusion. When I have an idea about something, it seems to me like the most brilliant idea in the world. That's just how it feels. That is the feeling, that is the intuition. And when a pessimist sees an idea, from somebody else, they tend to feel it's the worst idea in the world. That's their intuition, and that's just how things feel. And we are very much emotionally driven creatures. About 80 to 90% of our decision making, when we just go forward to let everything go, is emotional. Now, it's not rational, it's not logical, it's emotional. So I know that it's very unlikely, logically, reasonably speaking, stepping back from my idea, that any idea I randomly have is going to be the best idea in the world. So I know I need to instead evaluate what is the truth about this idea? What is the reality of this idea? How likely is it to be a great idea? How unlikely? And I need to gather evidence and evaluate probabilities. It may be 70% likely to be a really good idea, but to get at that likelihood, I need to evaluate various pieces of evidence and see how they contribute to the quality of this idea or detract from it. So that's another point I want to bring up. Those are 5 techniques that I use in specifically addressing the optimism bias, and that I think folks might find helpful.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing those. One of the other things in the book that I thought was quite interesting was loss aversion. Do you want to explain to the people listening what loss aversion is and talk a little bit about that?
Of course. So loss aversion is one of the cognitive biases that we experience. Like I said, there are over 100 of them. My book talks about the 30 most dangerous ones. So I talked about 2 of them, optimism bias and pessimism bias. Loss aversion is another one. Now, the interesting thing about it is that we tend to be more reluctant to lose things than gain things. It seems weird, why would it be different for you to, lose $5 versus gain $5? It feels logically, rationally, like it shouldn't be a difference, but it is. When scientists look at experiments with people who are asked how much they would cost, how much they would pay, how much effort would they go to prevent a loss, they are much more likely to put in more energy and time into preventing a loss than into securing a gain. For example, there was an interesting study where people were given a coffee cup of their alma mater, of their school. So college students were given a coffee cup of their school. And then the one group was given a coffee cup and one group was not. So there were same class, same demographics, divided into two groups. The group that was the half of the students who got the coffee cup, were asked, how much would it take for me to pay you? I can give you cash right now for you to give me back this coffee cup. And the average, when you average all of them out, it was something like $4.22. When the other half of the students were asked, how much would you pay to get this coffee cup? The average was something like $2.30. So that is an example of where people are much more reluctant to lose something than to gain something. When we have something, we tend to invest our emotional resources into it. We tend to feel attached to it. And so this feeling of attachment causes us to be more reluctant to lose it than we objectively should be. And that's tied back to our savanna environment. So in the savanna environment, it was really a bad idea to take too many risks. Because, if you took a risk to kill a mammoth, right? So your tribe took a risk to kill a mammoth. It's not like you could freeze the meat. You just need to eat as much of it as possible before, and the rest of it will rot. That's just how things worked. Didn't have a refrigerator. So it wasn't a wise idea for us to take risks because we couldn't store the resources. We couldn't invest in them in the future. But on the other hand, if you were trying to kill a mammoth and you got, a splinter of wood when you were throwing your, sharpened stick, and then you got blood poisoning, and then you died because there was not much medicine back then. People couldn't do, you rubbed some shaman leaves and that's all. You didn't really have much medicine, so we had a much more risk-oriented life. In other words, it was much worse for us to take risks and use up our very limited resources because our lives were very primitive. So we're the descendants of those who had a very strong fight or flight reflex, and we're the descendants of those who were pretty loss averse, who did not want to take these risks and to get the equivalent amount of resources. Now, in our world currently, we have much better medical systems. So, we have many other social safety welfare nets which protect us from losing our lives. So we are much more protected right now. And we can also, we're not going to kill a mammoth, but, you could still freeze meat, right? More importantly, you can invest your money in a bank. You can invest into yourself in your professional career. You can make sure that your organization does well going forward. So that's something that you can focus on. You can really focus on the future. And objectively, losing $1 and gaining $1 should be equally painful and pleasurable, but they're not. We still operate with those savanna reflexes. And that causes us to make a lot of bad decisions.
I want to add something to the listeners about loss aversion. So a technique that I've used in the past when I was coaching one-on-one clients, personal training, a technique that I used, if you set a goal or a challenge for a client or a group of clients, and if you say, if they make the challenge, if they get the results or hit the goal or whatever, if you give them a reward after that goal, let's say, for example, $100, it's not like $100 is not usually, a prize for a weight loss or like a fitness goal. But for example, let's just say if you reach this goal, you will get $100. You will win $100. Now, another way that you can go about this, if you make the client or all the clients in the group write out a check for $100, and say, if you don't hit that goal, the check will be cashed in. They've written out they're going to lose $100 if they don't hit the goal. They're much more likely to hit that goal because they don't want to lose that $100 rather than getting the goal and winning $100, for example.
Yep, that's definitely insightful, and that is one of the ways that loss aversion works. So there have been interesting experiments with salaries, where a group of people was given their salary in advance for the quarter. So, however much salary you have. So sales personnel were given their salary for a quarter. So presuming that they hit their sales numbers, 100%. And then if they didn't hit their sales numbers 100%, some of the money would be taken away, however much they didn't hit. And what the companies found that did this, they found that sales personnel, staff, were much more likely to hit their numbers when their money would be taken away than when than the typical structure where they would be actually given money for hitting their sales goals. So it works not simply in training, but it works in professional salary development and so on. Now that's kind of a pretty rough thing to do. So you have to have some people who are willing to go that route. So maybe give them an additional bonus for doing this experiment and going forward with this salary structure. But yes, loss aversion is a very powerful force that really motivates us in very many ways. An interesting dynamic subcomponent of this. So there's another cognitive bias that's related to loss aversion called the IKEA Effect. Now the IKEA Effect, named for the Swedish furniture giant IKEA, refers to when we create something, when we make something with our own hands, like IKEA furniture or anything else, we are much more likely to value it irrationally, way too much compared to what it's actually worth on the open market. That doesn't simply apply to building a table. So it was experimented when people, let's say, build a table and the actual objective value of it is $50 on the open market. People wouldn't let it go for anywhere lower than 100. That's kind of the idea. That's the idea for the IKEA effect. But it works in many other areas as well. So for example, if you want to sell your home and you did a lot of DIY home construction, home improvement into it, people will put a price in their home that's way above what it's actually worth on the open market. And they will not be willing to sell it for what it's actually objectively worth, regardless of all the DIY work. I did a lot of DIY work on my own home here. And I know that if I was selling it, all the DIY work, it would count for very little in terms of the value of the home. Now, it matters a lot to me. It's much more comfortable as a home, and our backyard is much nicer and so on. But I know that that's not the case. But other people, they would try to value their home much more. Or let's say if you're selling your business. So if you're selling your business, now a lot of my clients are surprised when business owners when they're getting to the sales stage and they want to thinking about cash out and so on, they typically price their business at about 10 times profit. That's the usual typical price that so if you get $2 million of profit a year, that's revenue minus costs, of course, then they price it at $20 million for the whole business. That's what they want to sell it. They're shocked when I tell them that the usual price for a business, that's what it sells for, is 2 to 3 times profit. So only 2 to 3 times profit. They're shocked, and many of them, it takes them a while to accept it. That's the reality of the situation. It's hard for us to deal with it because it's their baby. They built it up from scratch. So that's another dynamic that you want to be aware of, where loss aversion really causes negative consequences for companies and for organizations, for individuals, for professionals.
Awesome. Another note that I've gotten written down, which I thought was interesting, was the coin flip study. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So coin flip study has to do with loss aversion, and it's an interesting dynamic where you figure out the implications of loss aversion in a specific, clear way. So imagine that I give you $40. So you have $40, that's cash in hand. And then I ask you, would you give me back this $40, or would you pay me $40 for a coin flip, where if you get heads, you'll get $100, and if you get tails, you'll get 0. So listeners, viewers, take a couple of seconds to think about this. Would you pay me $40 for that? And all right, I presume you got your answer. Now, the large majority of people who are part of the study, something like 80%, would not. They'd keep the $40 cash. They keep it. They'd say, "Hey, it's this is what I want. I don't want to take a risk," and so on. Now, think about what is the actual mathematical consequence. We're talking about probabilistic thinking, mathing things. What is the coin flip? That's 50%, right? 50-50. So 50% of $100 is, of course, $50. So the coin flip is worth the mathematical equivalent, of $50. Many people will be like, "Oh, well, whatever, $40, $50, who cares?" But think about it, what happens with 10 coin flips. That's a difference between, from $10, the difference between $10 goes to $100. But what if it's 1,000 coin flips? What if it's 100,000 coin flips? If it's 100,000 coin flips versus keeping the cash each time, that's $4 million versus $5 million. So, math it out. 100,000 times 40 versus 100,000 times 50. So $4 million versus $5 million. That's a huge difference. And many people, when they hear about it this way, they're like, "Well, you didn't tell me this was a repeating case study. I might have thought about it differently if this was a repeating case study." But you know what? That is our intuition. Our intuition treats each individual decision in front of us as a one-off. It doesn't think of the context. So one of the techniques to address these problems, debiasing techniques, so sixth technique, is called consider the long-term future in repeating scenarios. Imagine that each daily decision that you're facing is a series of decisions. What would be the outcome of a series of decisions if you take it throughout your life? That's the reality of the situation. You're making decisions which are going to be consequential for the rest of your life if you're making the same decision going forward. So that you need to think about each decision as part of a series of decisions. Because if we just think about it as a one-off, we make bad decisions. And if over the rest of your life you make the conservative choice and earn 4 million rather than 5 million, that's a huge loss, especially with compounding interest. So you're losing out 20% of your income over a lifetime if you're making these choices. That's a huge loss. I mean, how much money, how much time would you pay to have 20% more income per year, additional with compounding interest? It's a huge, huge thing that we're talking about. And people don't really think about this, and they make bad choices, bad decisions, because they're not realizing the consequences of making these bad decisions. When the coin flip study is just kind of a toy example of how we're making bad decisions.
Yeah, sweet. I want to change to a slightly different topic. You mentioned relationships briefly in that book,
Yes.
but you've written a whole book on relationships and biasing. So I haven't read that book, but I want you to dive in a little bit about that. I remember in the book you spoke about, or in Never Go With Your Gut, you spoke about, and we briefly spoke about at the start of the episode, being like an optimist, and say, for example, you're in a relationship with a pessimist, or maybe you're in a business partnership. That can be a good thing. It could be a bad thing. Can you talk a little bit about relationships and biases?
Happy to. And the funny thing is, I am in a relationship with a pessimist. My wife of over 20 years is a pessimist, so she's just as pessimistic as I am optimistic. So when I need to run things by someone who's a pessimist, I often run things by her. So she works with me in our business. She's kind of behind the scenes person she's the co-principal with me of the business, Disaster Avoidance Experts. Pessimists are surprisingly easy to deal with once you know how to deal with them, but you have to learn how to deal with them. It's not natural, it's not intuitive, it's not easy, because the natural, intuitive thing is for the optimist to suggest ideas and for the pessimist to shoot them down. That's how the most typical dynamics work. Because the optimist, of course, feels like they have brilliant ideas and they share their brilliant ideas, and the pessimist feels like these are terrible ideas and they need to shut them down before something terrible occurs. That's the usual thing. That's the usual dynamic. And if you're in a relationship with someone who is a pessimist and you're an optimist, or vice versa, you'll do a lot of butting heads, around these types of issues. Same thing for business relationships. Now, in business situations, what usually tends to happen is that the CEO of a company, its top level leadership, is going to be someone who's an optimist. Being an optimist, pretty much all entrepreneurs, or almost all entrepreneurs, are optimists, because it takes someone who is really optimistic to start a small business, considering, in 15 years, about 3/4 fail, right? So to start up a company. Also, people in middle market, high and higher companies tend to be optimists, because being an optimist, it helps them to motivate themselves, helps them to go forward, take risks, and so on. But people in other roles in the company, including leadership roles, let's say the COO, the operations people, they often tend to be pessimistic. People in auditing, people in HR can go both ways, but people in legal, of course, tend to be pessimistic. So how do you work with these people? It's the same way that you work in relationships, the same way that you work in teams. I see teams fail a lot because of these clashes between optimists and pessimists. So what you need to do in those sorts of situations is understand, what I have learned to do in my relationship is to separate the generation of ideas and the evaluation of ideas. Generation of ideas, optimists are much better at this. That's just kind of a strength. A typical brainstorming exercise is a really bad approach to making decisions, because optimists are the ones who are generating ideas, and pessimists are kind of just sitting there stifling in their negativity and their criticism and their judgment. It's a hard thing for pessimists to deal with and a hard thing for optimists to deal with. That's not the way that you should do brainstorming exercises. And same thing in relationships. That's not the way you should do, you should make decisions in relationships. Optimists should be the ones who generate ideas, who generate notions, who generate, whether in relationships, the optimist can be the person who finds all the fun vacation spots that you want to go to, or all the, home improvement ideas, whatever, notions for anything. For business, the optimists should be the ones generating ideas on new products, whatever, all of these things. That's the great role for optimists. But then what they need to do is they need to give up control of these ideas and say, these aren't my ideas anymore. Give them over to the pessimists and say, here are a number of ideas. I feel they're brilliant, but it's your turn to evaluate them and see which of these ideas are actually going to be effective. So look at all the problems, look at all the flaws, and problem solve them. And that works really well, because when you tell the pessimist that your ideas, the ones that you generate, they're not final ideas. The interesting thing about pessimists and optimists is that optimists process when they speak. They have new ideas when they speak, and they just, they literally share half-baked potatoes. That's kind of how they speak. They share half-baked ideas, notions, things that come into their head. Pessimists really don't do that. Pessimists think a lot about what they say to make sure it's as perfect as possible before they speak. That is a really important component of what being a pessimist is. So a lot of pessimists, when they hear optimists speak, they think that the optimist has thought through an idea really well before speaking, and they're shocked that the optimist has thought through the idea really well, because it's obviously flawed in many ways, and they don't realize that optimists haven't. They're just, shooting off the hip. So you need to give these ideas to pessimists, and then pessimists figure out problems, and you need to help them make it safe for them, and tell pessimists that what you're saying is not the finalized idea. It's just you're shooting off the hip from the hip. You're just sharing some notions, and the pessimist will have the final call on evaluating, judging them, addressing problems. That really helps the pessimist. And so then the pessimist addresses these problems and implements them effectively, whether in a relationship or in company and professional setting. So that's the really good way to work with optimists and pessimists.
That's cool. I can't remember if you spoke about it in the book, but is there a technique to find out what biases you have? Like if you are...
Yes. So I mentioned the assessment in the end of the book. So chapter 7. Take a look at this. Right. Take a look at the assessment, and the assessment helps guide you through what's going on both for you and in your workplace, because different companies are also vulnerable. You have yourself as an individual and you have company cultures or family cultures, whatever you're focusing on, there's some dynamics there that will cause you to shift whatever cognitive biases are most relevant for you. So you want to use the assessment for yourself and for the dynamics, whatever group you want to assess, organization, to address problems that might be there.
Awesome.
Best technique.
So we've got to wrap things up shortly. So one last thing I want to ask you, in all your years of experience coaching and helping business owners and people avoid bad decisions, what's the most common mistake you see people make? And what's some advice that you want to leave with the listeners?
I mean, the most common mistake is that people don't differentiate, they don't realize that what feels true is not necessarily true at all. And what feels right is not necessarily the right thing to do at all. If we think about eating donuts, right? It feels very comfortable. It feels very desirable to eat a box of dozen donuts because that's how donuts are served, right? But you should not eat a box of dozen donuts. Or let's say there's a gallon of ice cream, right? Well, a serving size of ice cream is half a cup. Who eats half a cup of ice cream? I can't imagine that person, right? So, or like 10 potato chips from a bag of potato chips. Yeah, it doesn't work that way. So that is an instinct inbuilt from the savannah where when you had sugar or something salty, you need to eat as much of it as possible in order to survive and thrive. We're the descendants of those who did that. Now, that, of course, is a pretty bad idea in the modern world. Your gut steers you in the wrong direction. In the modern world around physical fitness, it steers you in just the same bad ways in mental fitness, in making the right decisions. So you've got to be very wary of the decision-making process. When something feels right, not necessarily right at all. When something feels true, not necessarily true at all. That is a fundamental thing that I want people, if they take away one thing from our interview, that's the one thing I want them to take away.
Awesome. Now, where do you want to send the listeners? Any websites or social media accounts?
Well, first of all, I want them to check out the book that we focus our conversation on, Never Go With Your Gut, How Pioneering Leaders Make the Best Decisions and Avoid Business Disasters. Then check out my website called disasteravoidanceexperts.com for blogs, videos, podcasts, virtual consulting, coaching, training, decision aids, guides, manuals, all of that sort of information. Especially there's a free 8-video module-based course on making the wisest decisions at disasteravoidanceexperts.com/subscribe. disasteravoidanceexperts.com/subscribe. So free 8 video-based modules course on making the wisest decisions. disasteravoidanceexperts.com/subscribe. And finally, I'm really active on LinkedIn. That's my favorite social media. So if you have any questions about anything you've heard in this interview, please connect with me there. Dr. Gleb Tsipursky on LinkedIn, GLEBTSIPURSKY.
Awesome. I'll chuck the links for the websites and the book in the show notes if anyone's interested. And yeah, we got to wrap things up. So thanks for coming on the show. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I really appreciate it.
All right, guys, if you enjoyed this, please take a screenshot and share it. I'd love to see who's listening. And also, please subscribe and give a rating on iTunes. Sending positive vibes to everyone out there. Thanks heaps for listening.